Hi, everyone. So we're going to set this up and uh, just a little intro to what are going to be talking about today. This is probably one, if not my favorite topic for the entire course of this class. So Behavior 2700. And the reason is because as I told you guys initially very early on, right? My goal in behavior analysis was always to really understand behavior, right? I did eventually want to start doing something with it in the sense of applying it, right? Trying to make improvements in the world, but especially in those early days, just understanding it was sufficient. And the philosophy of radical behaviorism itself is the framework that I started using, right? Just like you guys are going to start doing or are already doing to really understand these cool, like real world phenomena. So first, we're going to go over this video with Carl Sagan, whom is a very famous physicist who has done a lot of work and a lot of popular science kind of commentaries.
From this distant vantage point, the Earth might not seem of any particular interest. But for us, it's different. Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate or joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on the mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe, are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit? Yes. Settle? Not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known.
So here, in this video that you just watched, it gets pretty deep, right? So basically Carl Sagan is looking at how small the Earth is in comparison, right, to the whole universe. And the points he's making are really, really important. in the sense that, hey, we really are just really, really small in relation to everything else. So, but this is all that we have, right? This earth that we're on right now has tons of life, humans and non-humans. So they're all behaving. And this is going to get at what everyone wants to know whenever they want to think about, why people do things. Why do we want to understand behavior, right? Skinner asked the same question. So something I like to think about, right? Imagine we're chilling on the moon, probably drinking beer on a lawn chair or something, right? In our spacesuit, of course.
A moon beer. Think about it.
And when we look at the world, right? Far away, everything that we care about, right? All the people, all the pollution, all the problems exist on that earth. And how can we start to use a framework such as radical behaviorism to really start asking those kinds of big picture questions, right? Because we want to make significant changes. So this is exactly the type of question that Skinner really wanted to do, or he wanted to tackle, right? So a lot of Skinner's major theoretical works taken together may be conceptualized as a worldview that integrates scientific philosophy and behavior principles into a epistemologically consistent general theory of human behavior. Right, so each one of those books below are all written by B.F. Skinner himself, where he really tries to take this framework, right? Again, a worldview, some kind of behavioral lens to start looking at all kinds of human phenomenon and get to a coherent idea of how the principles are operating and how these principles can be used to ask those big picture questions. So I showed you guys this picture whenever we first started the semester. Right? And basically what I was trying to show you guys is me, Will, right? I walk into a restaurant and I see this, especially before I started really understanding behavior. What would I see? I would just see people talking. I'd see waiters. They're all just trying to have a good time, having a nice dinner, whatever. I didn't really think much of it. No one really does, right? But once you put on your behavioral lens, okay, imagine you at some points you're looking at the world through your regular day-to-day eyes, but then whenever you want to actually start understanding behavior, imagine you're just putting on some glasses. Then something magical happens, right? With those principles of behavior, you're able to start looking at the orderly relations between the behavior of the individuals and the environment, right? So as we said, and no one in this picture's behavior is subject to like some kind of a magical consciousness that's emanating from like the inner will of the soul, right? It's all based on the principles of behavior. All this behavior makes sense. We have a framework and the tools now to really start making sense out of this scene. So here, let us look at some things that we've talked about, like review some stuff we talked about. We talked about choice. We've talked about behavior analysis in the workplace. We've talked about the verbal operands, right? Verbal behavior. We've talked about, working with kids with autism, how significant that work is. We've talked about aversive control, right? There are a lot of people out there exclusively use that as a means to change behavior. And then we have people that are animal training. And again, earlier in the semester, we talked about looking for the like in the unlike, right? And this is exactly what we did as we tackled each of these issues, right? So imagine we grabbed the behavioral lens, right? And we focused it on the question that we're wanting to understand, or the phenomena that we understand. And what did we find? What did we see using this framework? We saw that choice, guess what? It involves the ABCs, right? Antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. Behavior in the workplace, same thing. Verbal operands can be broken down using this framework and the principles of behavior. Working with kids with autism, right, utilizes the principles of behavior to achieve that socially significant change, right? The aversive control, remember the punishment trap? It makes sense, right? That people are being reinforced for changing behavior through aversive control because generally it is an effective way to change behavior, right? But we don't want to limit ourselves to aversive control. We always want to use constructional methods with animal training, right? It's not just humans. All animals, as far as we know, are subject to these principles of behavior. So this really makes you ask the question, right? How are we able to apply this framework to so many behavioral phenomena, right, that look totally unrelated? that reason is because we have a flexible unit of analysis. Without getting too specific, if you guys want to have a really, really good time and really, really hurt your head over this idea, I'd recommend reading Skinner 35. I know how much Carlos loves that paper. But basically what Skinner was saying in that paper is that our unit is the three-term contingency, right? This is the framework. This is the lens that we use to look at all the behavioral phenomena. And we're not limiting ourselves to any specific stimuli in the environment or any kind of behavior, right? Because we know anything can function as an antecedent or as a consequence, any stimulus, right? Depending on the learning history. The behavior, we know that topographically it can look different, but functionally, right? What are the consequences that are maintaining it? So there is going to be an orderly relation, a functional relationship between the variables. And that functional relation or between the three-term contingencies is what we have as a unit of analysis. That is what we're studying, right? So on the bottom, we have three different levels of analysis, right? It's going to be a concept that's pretty new to you guys, possibly. But basically, think about this, right? Generally, we've been talking about down here, the behavior of the individual, right? We're taking the same three-term contingency to seeing why Carlos does the things he do, why I do the things that I do, right? Why Joe over there does the things he does. But what about neural responses? Do you think the things happening inside the brain, such as neurons firing, can be considered behavior and be a part of a three-term contingency? Actually, some of the research suggests that it actually is susceptible to the three-term contingency. There have been studies that shown that one of the neuromodulatory systems, the ventral tegmental area, which releases dopamine, is subject to consequences. So if you provide contingent stimulation to the VTA, it'll release more and more dopamine over time. And then we have the other end of the spectrum, right? So instead of looking, reducing from the individual to the brain, let's go up, right? Instead of one individual, let's look at the behavior of many people. This is going to be something like Carlos, who is actually working to be an expert. He's almost there. He's trying to make sense out of these behavioral phenomenon when you start adding lots of people into a situation, right? Because we see multiple control. Imagine multiple control of one person multiplied by 6, right? Because you have 6 different people that you're dealing with. It starts to get really complicated really fast. And Carlos is going to tell you a little bit about his work and how he's using our framework to start asking those big picture questions. So again, let's go back to the reading, right? So Malagodi says that this worldview conceptualization of radical behaviorism emphasizes the thoroughgoing meaning of radical and suggests that analysis and interpretation within any of the substantive areas should be comprehensive. And here, again, what he's saying is that we are thoroughgoing behaviorists. What that means is that we're not going to exclude any kind of behavioral phenomenon from our analysis, right? Remember John D. Watson, he was a different type of behaviorism. He was a methodological behaviorist. What he said was that only observable behavior was subject to a science of behavior. What that means is that anything that me and Carlos can't agree we both see shouldn't be considered part of the science because we would never be able to develop the necessary tools to measure that kind of stuff, right? However, Skinner said, you know, we're not going to reject something like a private event, right? I can't hear what Carlos is thinking, but to him, those private events are very, very real. So Skinner asked the question, it's not that those things don't exist, right? He can tell me that they exist. So I'm going to change the question to be comprehensive, to be thoroughgoing. How does he learn to talk about these things, right? Going back to verbal behavior, right? It might be a product of the verbal community. And this is what we mean by thoroughgoing. Nothing is outside of our analysis. We can always use our framework to break behavioral phenomena into the three-term contingency and start really seeing that order and the relationships between those phenomena. So Malagodi says, we define radical behaviorism as a comprehensive theory of behavior. We emphasize the following domains are interdependent, substantive components of an integrated worldview. So these are the three things he's talking about. So epistemological, right? That's basically the theory of knowledge. How do we come to know things, right? Our framework can be used to can be applied to that question, right? Might be a product of the verbal community. We can get even deeper into the nitty gritty of that phenomenon. When he says psychological, right? He's talking about both behavioral and a lot of that more psychological stuff like consciousness and executive functioning, right? Things that cognitive psychologists are really interested in. And basically what a radical behaviorist says is that, hey, I'm not going to disagree with you. I'm not going to say that you're dumb because these things don't exist. I'm going to say, you know what? Let's actually take a look at it. We believe that our framework, right, because it is thoroughgoing, it is comprehensive, let's look at the behaviors that are involved in executive function. How can we start applying this framework to start answering those questions and, you know, potentially build those collaborative relationships with psychologists that want to also ask similar big picture questions? And again, cultural analysis, just because you have more than one individual doesn't mean that that's outside the scope of what a behavior analyst can understand. And you'll see that this is what we're purposely trying to extend, again, because we are thoroughgoing and comprehensive. So now, I want you guys to practice using your behavioral lens by watching these cool videos, okay? So remember, behavior is a constant stream. The behavior principles are always operating no matter what situation you're looking at. So as you go through the videos, use your behavioral lens to try to see some order in the behaviors, okay? Some principles. And we're gonna talk a little bit about one. So in that video that we just watched with Kevin from The Office, right? You saw at the end, he started using a little, what was it, a clipboard?
A clipboard.
Right? Clipboard to scoop up the chili and put it back into the pan, or what's it called?
The pot.
Yeah, the pot. Thank you, Carlos. So why do you think that happened, right? How would you use the principles of behavior to explain that? So I'll give you a second to kind of think of it, mull it over. Remember, there's just that video alone, tons of examples of verbal behavior and other operant behavior occurring. So that's just one that I decided to focus on, right? So I would kind of think of it as generalization, right? He's learned to scoop things into, like, let's say a broom, a sweeper, and the little dustpan, right? He has a history doing that. So it might be an instance of generalization where he grabs something that he can use to scoop and put it into another item, which would be the pot, right? And we see principles of behavior operating. So let's look at this video.
How's Mr. Summer doing?
Actually, sir.
He's perfectly fine, sir. He's in tip-top shape.
Good.
Oh, what are you wearing, a cup?
People try to hit me there more than you'd think.
So why do you think the janitor wears a cup? Do you think he's just a crazy janitor? Although they try really hard in the show to portray him that way, as behavior analysts, we know that his behavior makes sense, right? There has to be some kind of learning history that has reinforced him wearing cups. And again, negative reinforcement, right? You just saw one instance in which wearing that cup avoided, postponed, delayed an aversive consequence, which is getting hit in a private region, which we know hurts a lot, okay? Again, principles of behavior always operating. So what about analyzing the behavior of Ron Swanson? Why is he so epic?
See, it's Ron Swanson.
She's here.
Who's here?
My ex-wife, Tammy, too. I can smell the sulfur coming off her cloven hooves.
And see, in that example, right? Ron Swanson just told us what stimulus he was attending to when he tacted that his wife was nearby, right? So instance of verbal behavior, very clean. And, not even Ron Swanson is outside the scope of a behavioral analysis.
I think he is.
So what about here? Sorry for the... There's even principles of behavior operating there too. So what are they? Quiz. I'm just kidding.
So, do you recognize any of these men?
I was hiding in the bathroom stall, so I didn't see his face, but
I heard him. He was singing along to the music at the bar.
Do you remember what he was singing?
I think it was that song, I Want It That Way.
Backstreet Boys, I'm familiar. Okay.
Number one, could you please sing the opening to I Want It That Way?
Really? Okay. You are my fire.
Number two, keep it going.
The one desire.
Number three.
Believe when I say.
Number four.
I want it that way.
Tell me why.
Ain't nothing but a heartache.
Tell me why.
Ain't nothing but a mistake.
Now number five. I never wanna hear you say.
Woo! I want it that way.
Oh, chills. Literal chills.
It was number five. Number five killed my brother.
Oh my God, I forgot about that.
Okay, so again, in that video alone, lots of things going on, lots of behavioral principles operating. So one of them that I thought was really noteworthy here was the introverbal, right? You saw that there was a chain of events, right? You had Peralta's verbal behavior functioning as a stimulus for someone else's behavior, right? And we see them kind of link, finish each other's sentences, right? So verbal stimulus sets the occasion for a verbal response. Generalized condition reinforcer in this case would be the continuation of the song, right? And again, just another of the many, many examples of how the principles of behavior can really, really be seen everywhere.
You know, I want to do that. Oh, my turn. All right. Something that we've been talking about throughout the entire semester is something that me and Will have constantly been going back and forth about, talking about, yes, we understand behavior analysis in the controlled setting, but what, right? What does that mean? Why should I care? And that's something I want to just touch on a little bit over this lecture, just to say that there is research and then there is a subfield of behavior analysis that is focusing on things that a lot of people know as cultural analysis, right? And I'll go into detail about what that means. But as you can see on here on the slide is, yeah, we could change individual behavior and address single problems, but what about poverty? What about violence? What about corruption, oppressive governments, and what about climate change, right? All these things are extremely complex, and that's something that we've been mentioning and dropping hints about throughout the entire semester, that not only does it get complex in the individual sense, right? Because it can get pretty complex. We talked about multiple control and talked about multiple variables affecting the individual. But imagine how complex it could get whenever we start adding multiple people, right? Not only 5 people, 10 people, but whenever we're talking about societies, when we're talking about societal change. And that's something that we can, and I have a joke going on, and it's not really a joke, it's just something that I really think about. So whenever me and Will start talking about social issues, I tell him, we put a damn man on the moon, but we can't fix poverty, right? We've sent probes across our solar system, but we can't solve issues across governments, right? And this should just tell you about how complex it is to change and understand why people do what they do, and especially in a large sense, right? So these are the kind of things that I want y'all to start thinking about as I go throughout the next section, really. And especially is, why haven't we done more? And I think one of the big issues is because it is so complex, right? It's not as simple as, okay, I identify a specific reinforcer for an individual. Maybe we can change the reinforcer, and then you'll change behavior, right? It doesn't really work that way whenever you're dealing with millions of people. But to that extent, I'm not saying that reinforcement or reinforcers aren't out there, right? So one thing to pay attention in these pictures, right? So we have specific riots happening here. We've heard about the ones that were happening in Hong Kong not too long ago. And we might even have some riots here in the United States throughout time, right? Specifically in the recent years with a lot of political divide. We have a lot of drug trafficking even now. Something to keep note about, I actually just read an article about how COVID-19 actually affected a lot of the drug cartels, because there is, the demand is pretty low, right? Because people aren't moving around as much. So it's affecting their specific drug organizations, right? So it's kind of something that where variables that affect one person also affect millions of other people, right? All around the globe. We have poverty. We have people living in poverty here in the United States, across different countries, in Africa and India, you name it, there's going to be poverty, right? And we also have is a lot of fossil fuels, right? We've been trying to battle this out for ages now. Across decades, we've known about how the CO2 emissions is going to affect our future long time ago. But have we really done anything? We have, but not to the extent where we want to be, right? I'm not saying that there's not a lot of companies out there switching over. Shell just announced that they wanted to go net zero by 2050. So there are being measures taken, but we can always do better, right? Specifically because as behavior analysts, we understand human behavior, right? We hope to understand it and change it. So these are the realms that we should be striving to change and we should be striving to work in. It's just that we're not doing it to an extent where it's making any, at least, impactful change, right? But of course, not saying that there's not any people out there trying to do anything. We are. It's just extremely complex. So something, so something, there we go, yeah. So Skinner, some person, some time, right? The good old Skinner said, it is the effect of the group, not the reinforcing consequence for the individual members, which is responsible for the evolution of the culture. So he said this in 1981 in an article called Selection by Consequences. And all he was basically, and this was purely conceptual work, right? It means he didn't present any data. All he said was, hey, kind of the levels that Will was talking about, right? He introduced the 3 levels, the evolution applied to genes, operant behavior applying to the individual, and he introduced something known as possibly cultural selection, right? Meaning, hey, maybe there's consequences out there that don't affect just one person, but maybe it starts affecting groups, right? Starts affecting different members within a society or different members within a group. So all this was purely conceptual. It was just an idea that he was thinking about, saying, like Will was saying, taking our framework and saying, maybe it applies everywhere. Maybe it applies even to societies and large groups. So with that, he started, the 1981 paper sat there, and it kind of just started a big rush for a lot of other people to start dissecting that, right? What exactly did he mean? Can behavior analysis start looking at behavior in large social environments? What exactly did he mean by culture? And what are we going to be analyzing when we study culture, right? And being honest, up until now, although it's called cultural analysis, I rather look at it as looking at behavior in social settings, right? Because culture is a big term, is a big umbrella term for a lot of things. And I think it's easier to look at it as in, let's look at behavior and how it's affected in social environments where there's a lot of other people in play. So with that, Dr. Glenn, which is actually the founder of our Department of Behavior Analysis here at UNT, she developed something called the meta-contingency, right? So she started looking at she actually looked at the department and said, hey, how is this department still here, right? I see a lot of people coming in, a lot of different faculty members, a lot of different students, and I continuously see them go out, right? They graduate every year, faculty start retiring, but the entity, which is the Department of Behavior Analysis, still holds. It's still here, right? So there has to be some kind of process occurring for that to happen over time, kind of like the individual, right? We see that there's different things in our environment that happens every single day, but we're still here, right? What we have is a repertoire, right? We start learning different skills, and she just applied it and conceptualized it to a department, to a group. So she started breaking that down. She started doing a little bit more of the conceptual work in the 1988. She actually started in 1988 and started going through the 90s, early 2000s. And it wasn't until 2009 where they actually started doing some experimental work with her conceptualizations. But what the meta-contingency is, a contingent relation between recurring interlocking behavioral contingencies, having an aggregate product, and selecting environmental events or conditions. what does that even mean, right? And what that means is that, let's look at this picture as an example. Here, let's just say this is an example of a UPS company or Amazon company, right? So what we have here, in order for a package to get shipped out, right, it doesn't happen by one single person. It usually happens by a lot of people doing a lot of different jobs, right? So here in this specific picture, you have a conveyor, someone picking up the package in the conveyor. He sends it off to someone that packages it. Then they send it off to someone that might inspect it. And then they get shipped over to the driver, which then you have a finished product, right? So there's, as you see here, there's multiple behaviors occurring not at the same time, right? But one is dependent on the other. So this person can inspect the product until it's packed. And this person can pack it until he receives it from someone else, right? So this is what we call interlocking behavioral contingencies, meaning that the behavior of one individual sets the occasion for the other person to behave, right? And then so forth and so forth, no matter how many people you really have, right? So the essence of this one is, all it is, it's you have a lot of behaviors happening because they're dependent on each other. So that's what we mean by interlocking behavioral contingencies. And this is how usually we really interact in the real world, right? Whenever you're having a regular conversation, if I have a conversation with Will, I'm not going to respond until he responds to me. And it's going to continue, right? Because it would be really silly if I say something and he just remains quiet. I just go on, go on, go on, go on. I need that verbal stimulation from him as well, right? And this happens for anything that we see out in the real world. So what occurs after this is that you have an aggregate product. So it could be a tangible product, or it can be an arbitrary product, right? So it can be the physical product of the box, or it could be a finished symphony, right? A lot of people working together to have a finished product. And what that means after that, we also have a selector, right? Or a cultural consequence. Think about it as a reinforcer. You have people out in the environment that reinforce all of this happening, right? And in this case, it's going to be us, the people that order those specific shipments, right? Because Amazon wouldn't exist, or none of these behaviors would exist if we weren't buying anything, right? So as you can see here, it's a recursive nature, just like it is in the operant, right? You have the behavior occurring, and then you have the consequences occurring, right? So if you have a consequence, or if you have a reinforcer, you're going to start seeing these behaviors occur a lot more often. And that's essentially, this is really quick way of just to think about what the meta contingency is, right? But one thing to keep in mind is that the meta contingency, although it's a really, really great conceptual tool to look at a lot of things in culture, it does not explain everything that's occurring in culture whatsoever, right? We're barely tapping into what behaviors look like in the social setting. So by no means is this explaining everything that we see in culture, right? This is just one way of possibly looking at what's really going on out there in society. So with that, culture analysis, or as again, I like to say, studying behavior in social environments, what that means is that they're aiming to take the framework of behavior analysis, right? We're not taking anyone else's framework. All we're doing is trying to keep the same framework that we use, the same behavior principles, and trying to understand large cultural phenomenon, right? Maybe how do cultural practices apply? I know in one of the spooky topics I asked, why do y'all think specific religions, specific art, or specific sciences are surviving right now and not others, right? That's something that we might be able to look at with cultural analysis. Another is behavior of individuals within a group, right? You have a large group, but you have some people within the group that aren't happy in that group, that may be defectors, that maybe are outcasts, right? Maybe we could start using cultural analysis to start understanding that as well. Another big thing is cooperation, right? In cooperation, we always need more than one person. We have a large literature on cooperation as well. Competition between individuals might be another thing, right? If we have to understand cooperation, let's go ahead and look at competition and how that might affect cooperation as well. And not only that, but cooperation and competition between cultures, right? Right now we have what we all might understand as a global economy, right? If one specific country does something, it's going to affect the entire world, right? If America decides to stop trading with China, that's going to affect a lot of different people. So it's different cultures that we have to start getting to cooperate and not only compete, right? Although something to also think about is that competition sometimes is healthy, right? It's very healthy in the economic sense, right? So, but what are those boundaries? How much competition is good for us and how much cooperation is good for us, right? Because we can't go all one way or the other, because it's definitely good. We're also going to have a lot of repercussions that way. So these are just some of the things that we cultural analysis aims to do. And this is something that we can use behavior analysis to start tackling, right? It's not a brand new science. We're not using any new principles. The only thing that we're doing is we're taking the same principles that you're learning in class, such as stimulus control, generalization, reinforcement, and we're applying them to behavior in a large social setting.
All right, guys. So going back to Carl Sagan, right? And he says, the distant image of our tiny world underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. And the reason why I selected that quote, right? If I'm going to be really frank with you, a lot of the times I'll get on the news and I honestly will get a little sad because the world seems to suck all the time, right? Like no matter how we've advanced, right? I've been watching Vikings a lot, right? The world sucked back then, and we'd imagine with all this technology that we'd be better off, but the world still sucked. We still have people killing each other. We still have people fighting. We still have, all these deadly diseases that we're not, working to prevent and stuff like that. Protests are occurring all over the place. It's just not a good situation, right? And what makes me really sad is that all that is happening. And again, this is Earth, right? This is everything that we care about is here. We don't really have that option to go anywhere else, right? We're screwed when we mess this up. So as Carl Sagan said, it underscores our responsibility. And that's where I think we as behavior analysts come in, right? As a cosmologist, he's really good at talking about, big picture and, really putting the Earth in its place in the sense of the vastness of the universe, right? But our subject matter, our expertise is the behavior of organisms. So more so than anyone else, right? We have a responsibility to use this framework to understand all behavioral phenomena and be able to develop ways to systematically change whatever behavioral practices, exactly as Carlos was saying, aren't working, right? Pollution. It's a big problem. How can we use our principles to start helping people change their lifestyles, right? Because it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a process. It's going to take a lot of collaboration, but it is our job to do this. So some takeaway points for this is that, remember, radical behaviorism, radical means thoroughgoing, right? Comprehensive. It's the framework that we use to understand all behavioral phenomena. How can we do this, right? Because we have a flexible unit of analysis. Our antecedents, behaviors, and consequences aren't finite classes of, only these things can be antecedents and only these things can be consequences. Literally anything in the environment and any behavior can come under operant control. And the sizes, right, the types of behaviors is not just going to be something like picking up my mug, lifting it, right? It could be something as complex as me and Carlos lecturing, understanding behavior analysis. So this flexible unit is what gives us the ability to be able to apply our framework to all behavioral phenomena. And again, it's not just conceptualization. It's not just Skinner thinking in his chair about how behavior analysis can be used in the world. We actually done it, right? The world of applied behavior analysis and working with children with autism and education and rehab, right? All these people have taken this framework to ask those other big picture questions where they're like, hey, it's not just enough to understand, we want to help people. And ultimately, you guys have got to the point where you guys understand the principles of behavior, so now it's your turn. How are you going to use the framework to ask those big picture questions that interest you? I look forward to reading some of y'all's work someday and seeing how you guys contributed to making the world suck a little less. So that's it for this lecture. So let us know if you have any questions.
Bye.